The first was force. The fleet, the armada, the weapons, and the demonstrated willingness to use them on anyone who required a demonstration. The second was inevitability. The deep, settled, unexamined belief, shared by every species in the hegemony's reach, that the Council had always existed, and therefore would always exist. That tribute had always been paid, and therefore would always be paid. And that no realistic alternative to the current arrangement was worth the energy of imagining. Force could be rebuilt after a military setback. But Fesivara's return to Council space began doing something to the inevitability that force could not repair. She did not make a speech in any official forum. She did not publish a manifesto that the Council's censors could remove from circulation. She simply talked, to colleagues, to former students, to beings she had known for decades in the academic and diplomatic networks of the Aethon Collective and beyond. She talked about what she had seen in Geneva, about the hospital, about the music in the streets, about the flower stall and the child with the drum, about the small boat crossing the lake for no reason except that it was a good morning to be on the water. She talked about the conversation in the round room. She repeated to anyone who would sit still long enough to hear it the answer to the question she had asked. About the yes that is given so many times, it becomes the only word a civilization knows how to say. And people listened. Within 6 months of the Heliopause battle, 3 member civilizations of the Hegemony Council had quietly failed to deliver their scheduled tribute payments. They offered technical explanations, administrative delays, resource processing shortfalls, logistical complications requiring additional review, but the Council's auditors could find no supporting evidence for any of these explanations, and everyone in the relevant rooms understood that the explanations were not the point. The point was that 3 civilizations had looked at what humanity had done, and had asked themselves, some of them for the very first time in living memory, whether they had to keep doing what they had always been doing. The Council called it the Ose precedent, and they used the term as a condemnation, a diplomatic contagion, a dangerous idea that needed to be identified and contained before it spread further. By the time they named it, 5 more civilizations had followed the first 3. Vorath Cell had never recovered his reputation after the Earth mission. In the Council's internal politics, failure was always manageable. Was someone else's failure. But Vorath Cell had been the one standing on the bridge when 12 warships were disabled by an enemy no one had bothered to take seriously. And no amount of administrative reshuffling had managed to move that fact out of the record. He had gone from senior emissary to a desk position, with a title that sounded important and a function that was not, in a department that handled disputes too minor for anyone significant to care about. He had a great deal of time to sit alone and think. What he thought about, with increasing focus as the months passed and the Ose precedent spread, was that the problem had a source, and the source was a 71-year-old human woman sitting in a building in Geneva. If she were gone, the argument was straightforward. Human leadership would fragment under the pressure of disagreement. The internal conflicts that had defined most of their history would surface again. The decision-making structure that had produced the single-word refusal would collapse without the person at its center. And the Council could approach the situation again from a position of comparative stability and offer terms that were harder to refuse. He made a plan. He built it carefully over 4 months, using no official Council resources, leaving no records in any auditable system, and involving only individuals whose personal interest in seeing the plan succeed was as strong as his own. 6 operatives were quietly positioned at various points around the solar system. 3 were non-human. 3 were humans recruited through channels that did not officially exist, and would deny existing if asked. The plan was designed to execute during the Secretary General's scheduled transit through Titan Station, the great orbital transfer hub above Saturn that served as the main connection point between Earth's inner system and the outer colony worlds. It was a well-constructed plan. It failed because of Kwame Asante. Kwame Asante was a dock loadmaster at Titan Station, a 34-year-old man from Kumasi who had worked cargo logistics in the outer system for 9 years, and who was, by any reasonable measure, exactly the kind of ordinary person that very large and very serious plans tend to overlook entirely. He was exceptionally good at his job. The nature of the job was noticing things, and Kwame noticed things with a consistency that his supervisors had long since stopped remarking on, because it had become simply expected. He noticed when cargo manifests did not quite match the physical dimensions of the containers being logged. He noticed when maintenance crew members were present in sections of the station that their access credentials did not cover. He noticed when people who had signed in under one professional category were spending time in areas that had nothing to do with that category. 3 days before the Secretary General was scheduled to arrive, Kwame Asante submitted a security incident report. It was a technically written report, calm in its language and specific in its details, and it went first to a mid-level security supervisor who almost filed it in a low-priority queue, and then read it a second time and felt something cold move through her. The station entered lockdown within the hour. 4 of the 6 operatives were in custody before the Secretary General's shuttle had even departed Earth. The other 2 were apprehended the following day, attempting to leave the system on a freight vessel registered under a name that did not correspond to any existing company. The Secretary General arrived at Titan Station on schedule. She was briefed on everything that had happened and who had been responsible for authorizing it, and she sat quietly with that information for a while before making a decision that surprised her security team considerably. She directed that the full details of the attempted operation, every piece of evidence, every name, every chain of authorization, be made entirely public. All of it. The trial of Vorath Cell was broadcast across the galaxy. It lasted 11 days. Every session was open and accessible to any observer who wished to watch. Every piece of evidence was presented clearly and then formally challenged by defense representation. Every witness was questioned and cross-examined under established procedural rules. Vorath Cell himself was given full access to legal support and was given meaningful opportunity to speak in his own defense. He was convicted. He was sentenced to a defined term in a rehabilitation facility, under conditions that were documented publicly. And he was not executed, not disappeared into a system designed to ensure he was never inconvenient again, not handed to a punitive process that operated outside the view of any observer. This was, in some ways, more startling to the watching galaxy than any of the military engagements that had come before it. A species that had just survived an assassination attempt authorized by a senior official of the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy had responded by giving that official a fair and transparent trial. In council chambers and diplomatic halls and academic institutions across 47 civilizations, the same question circulated again, not in fear this time, not with the sharp edge of military threat, but in something much closer to genuine wonder. What are they? The proposal for a new interstellar body came from 7 civilizations simultaneously, 4 of them current council members, and 3 that had existed outside the hegemony's formal structure for generations. It was called the Accord of Equals, and it was modest in what it claimed to be. It was not a replacement for anything at first. It had no fleet, no tribute mechanism, no tool for compelling anyone to do anything they had decided not to do. It was, at its most basic level, a table, and an open invitation to sit at that table, and a set of principles governing what conversations at that table would be allowed to sound like. Humanity was asked to help write the charter. Miriam Osei was 73 years old by the time the first full assembly of the Accord of Equals convened. still small in stature, still upright, still in possession of the particular stillness that had been making rooms go quiet for 2 years now. She stood before an assembly that included representatives of 22 species, some of them council members, some of them former tributary civilizations, some of them peoples who had never had any direct contact with Earth before this moment. She did not speak about victory. She did not speak about humanity's strength, or the Council's failure, or the battles that had been fought and the costs they had carried. She spoke about the word no, about what it truly costs to say it, and about what saying it requires you to build in its place. Refusing something wrong is only the beginning, she told them. It is the easier part, in some ways, because it is reactive. It is a response to something being done to you. The harder work is what comes after. Building something worth protecting. Something worth the full weight of the refusal. That is where most efforts fail. She looked across the assembled faces, all different, all watching. We did not say no because we were powerful. We said it because we had decided what we were for, and quiet compliance was not compatible with being that thing. The chamber was still. Outside the windows, an unfamiliar sky held unfamiliar stars, different constellations than any human had grown up learning. A sky that once would have seemed impossibly remote, and was now simply where the next conversation was being held. In the archive of galactic history, a file had been logged 2 years earlier, an audio recording, 11 seconds in length, of one human voice speaking one word into an open channel, with the whole galaxy listening. The file had been accessed more times in those 2 years than any other document in the archive's 4,000-year history. And in 47 civilizations, and 22 more, and in quiet rooms where new conversations were beginning to happen, beings who had spent generations giving the only answer they knew how to give were learning, slowly, with difficulty, real uncertainty about what came next, what it felt like to reach for a different word. Some had joined willingly, long ago, and had genuinely benefited from the protection and trade access that Council membership provided. Some had been absorbed so gradually that the idea of existing outside the Council had become simply unthinkable, not because they were enslaved in any obvious way, but because the memory of independence had faded so completely that they would not have known what to do with it. And some, a smaller number, quieter in public, always careful about which conversations they had in which rooms, had joined under pressure, and had been waiting, without much hope, for circumstances to change. 3 species from this last group made a decision in the weeks following the Armada's retreat. They made it quietly, without informing the Council, without registering any official diplomatic intent, and without telling each other what they were planning until they were already en route to the outer edge of the solar system. The 3 species, the Aethon Collective, the Merev of the Spiral Reaches, and the Toulon Federation, each sent a single representative aboard a single unarmed research vessel that had been quietly repositioned in the outer system months before any of the recent events had begun. The 3 representatives met aboard that vessel and introduced themselves to each other with the particular awkwardness of beings who had taken a very significant risk without knowing if anyone else was doing the same thing. And then they sent a narrow-beam transmission to Earth, very carefully worded, very cautious in tone, asking if someone was willing to talk. Miriam Osei's office responded within 4 hours. "Come to Geneva," the message said. "You are welcome here." The 3 delegates had prepared themselves carefully for what they expected to find on Earth. Their briefings had included everything the Council's intelligence services had compiled on humanity over 3 decades, plus the full tactical data from the heliopause engagement, plus whatever they could piece together from trader reports and intercepted public broadcasts. They had reviewed all of it, compared their conclusions, and arrived at a picture that was broadly consistent across all three delegations. Humanity was a highly aggressive species. It had spent the majority of its recorded history fighting with itself. Its technology had been developed largely in the context of military conflict. Its response to the tribute request had been immediate and completely without negotiation. Its defense of its home system had been precise, efficient, and operated without any apparent hesitation. They expected to land on a world that felt like a military installation. They landed instead in Geneva on a warm afternoon in late autumn, and within the first hour they had been offered food they could not safely eat, but appreciated the gesture enormously, welcomed by a crowd of curious and almost embarrassingly enthusiastic humans, who appeared to have never encountered beings quite like them, and found this remarkable rather than threatening, and guided through a city that was full of music, not military music, not ceremonial music marking a recent victory, street music, a man playing a stringed instrument outside a small cafe, a group of young people singing together in four-part harmony near a public fountain, a child of perhaps 6 years banging enthusiastically on a small drum in a way that strongly suggested she had been practicing for about 3 weeks and considered herself already a professional. Thesavara of the Athon Collective, the lead scholar of the three, and the one who had argued most persistently for this trip, stood at the edge of a public market and tried to reconcile what she was seeing with everything she had been told to expect. The Merev representative, a quiet being called Vosten, stopped beside a stall selling cut flowers and stared at the arrangements for a long time, without saying a single word. The Toulon delegate, whose name translated approximately as Reth, watched a group of human children playing a game that involved a ball and a great deal of running and falling down. Small sound that in Tahlan roughly translated to confused, but not unpleasantly so. The formal meeting was held the following morning in a small room in the UN building, not the Grand Assembly Chamber with its famous skylight, but a round room with low furniture and wide windows looking out over a lake that caught the early light in long flat reflections. Miriam Osei arrived with 2 advisors and a translator. She shook hands, a human greeting custom she briefly explained, and that the delegates accepted with varying degrees of physical awkwardness, and sat down across from Thesavara, without ceremony, as if this were a perfectly ordinary meeting between people who simply had things they needed to discuss. The beings caring for them were doing so with a level of emotional investment that I found. She paused, searching through the translation. Notable. We call them doctors and nurses, Miriam said. The council operates medical facilities, Thesavara said carefully, but they are administered by efficiency algorithms. Care is provided in proportion to the patient's projected economic value to the wider system. She looked out at the lake for a moment. Your facility appeared to operate on a different principle entirely. It does, Miriam said. Thesavara looked back at her. I want to ask you the question that the council cannot bring itself to ask, she said. You could have negotiated. You could have offered partial tribute, bought time, entered the system gradually while building strength. You could have preserved your people from immediate danger at manageable cost. Why did you not do any of those things? Miriam was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she was choosing her words carefully enough to be useful. We studied what happened to the species that complied, she said at last. Not just the ones that were destroyed outright or enslaved immediately. Those outcomes are easy to understand. We studied the ones that said yes and survived, that kept their planets, kept their governments, kept the appearance of being independent civilizations. She paused. What we saw was that over time, generation by generation, they stopped being themselves. The compliance became their identity. The deference became their culture. The habit of saying yes became so deep that it was no longer experienced as a choice. It was simply how things were, and had always been, and would always be. She folded her hands on the table. We have a saying where I come from. Give someone an inch, and they will take a mile. We decided the inch was not theirs to take. Thesivara was quiet for a long time after that. You knew the risk, she said finally. We knew the risk, Miriam agreed. And you said no anyway. We said no anyway. Thesivara looked out at the lake. A small wooden boat was crossing it, moved by a single human being, pulling oars in the old way, going slowly, going nowhere in particular, for no reason that was visible, except that it was a pleasant morning, and the water was calm, and being on it seemed like a good idea. She thought about her own civilization, about the compliance that had become so gradual and so complete that it no longer registered as compliance at all. About the yes that had been given so many times, it had stopped being a response and become simply a posture. About the conversations that never happened in the rooms where important things were decided, because everyone in those rooms had long since stopped imagining that different decisions were available. She thought about what it would mean for other species to hear the story of one word. She stood, thanked Miriam Osei with genuine warmth, and left Geneva the following morning with the Merev and Toulon delegates beside her. She carried no weapons. She carried no military intelligence useful to any enemy. She carried only one thing, an idea. Specifically, the idea that the answer currently given to a question is not the only answer that exists. And specifically, the knowledge of what it had cost to act on that idea, and that the cost had been paid and survived. In the context of the galaxy as it currently existed, with 47 civilizations locked into a structure built on the assumption that no other structure was possible, that idea was more dangerous than any weapon Thesivara could have taken home. The council chamber on the hegemony's capital world of Velkara had not seen a unanimous vote in over 800 years. Species voted against species, bloc voted against bloc, and the 47 member civilizations spent most of their political energy arguing about resource allocation, territorial rights, and the exact definition of several treaty clauses that had been disputed for centuries. But when Vorat Sel returned from Earth and delivered his report, his very careful, very thorough, and deeply embarrassing report, the chamber went quiet in a way it almost never did. And then it voted. All 47 civilizations, all 47 hands raised, all 47 seals pressed, all 47 voices saying the same thing at the same time in their own languages. The hegemony armada would be deployed against Earth. The armada was not a fleet in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a statement of absolute power rendered in metal and fire. 412 warships, ranging from destroyers the length of a small city to dreadnoughts large enough to block out a star from the surface of an orbiting planet. It carried troop transport vessels, siege platforms, atmospheric processor units designed to make worlds uninhabitable, and a full logistics chain that stretched across 3 star systems. The Armada had been fully assembled and deployed only 4 times in the Council's 4,000-year history. 3 of those times, the target civilization had surrendered before the Armada even crossed into their home system. The 4th time, the conflict had lasted 11 days before the opposing species ceased to exist as an organized force. 412 warships were now pointed directly at Earth. Humanity had 3 months. 3 months passed between the departure of Vorath Sel's fleet and the arrival of the first long-range sensor returns showing the Armada's approach vector. 3 months that Earth's governments used in a way that surprised even some of the people doing the work. They did not panic. They did not quietly draft surrender terms and hide them in a drawer just in case. They did not spend their time in fear, though fear was certainly present in every room where honest conversations were being had. They built, they improved, they trained, and they adapted. Engineers from 7 different nations worked in rotating shifts around the clock on the captured weapon and sensor components recovered from Vorath Cell's disabled ships. Within the first month, they had reverse-engineered the Council's targeting software and integrated it into the Aegis network. Within the second month, a team of physicists at the New Bangalore Research Station cracked a theoretical model they had been developing for 12 years, a method for disrupting fold space drives mid-transit, which would prevent enemy ships from making the precision short-range jumps they relied on to reposition during battle. Every soldier, pilot, and tactical officer in every branch of service across all 14 colony worlds ran combat drills every single day. Not the same drills repeated on rotation, but entirely different scenarios each time, designed by a team of strategists whose only job was ensuring that no human military unit ever became predictable to an outside observer. The Aegis network was expanded, reinforced, and given new autonomous response parameters that allowed it to operate effectively even if all human command personnel were incapacitated. Colony worlds that were not on the direct approach vector began constructing their own smaller defensive networks, sharing designs and data openly across the human communication grid in real time. And in homes and schools and community centers across 14 planets, people went about their lives, frightened, yes, but carrying something else as well. Something harder to name, but very easy to recognize in the way they looked at each other, and in the way they kept working, even when the fear was loudest. The Armada arrived at the edge of the solar system on a Tuesday morning. 412 warships filled the long-range display screens at Aegis Command, like a moving wall, an organized, dense wall of metal and power that blotted out the background stars on the sensor readouts. They came in formation, steady and enormous, and every person in every command center across human space looked at the same data feed and took a very slow, very deliberate breath. General Ibarra, promoted in the months of preparation, sat in the same chair he had occupied 3 months earlier. Beside him, General Hassan stood with her arms crossed and her eyes level on the tactical display. Aegis confirms 412 contacts, a sensor officer called. Confirmed, Hassan said. All Aegis units to full combat readiness. Colony defensive networks are live. Full disruption arrays are online and holding position. Begin the Battle of the Heliopause. What followed was 19 hours of combat unlike anything the galaxy had ever witnessed. The Council's Armada operated on a battle doctrine built and refined over 4,000 years. It was sophisticated, layered, and nearly perfect against any opponent that fought the way the Armada expected an opponent to fight. It expected centralized command structures that could be identified and disabled, cutting off the enemy's ability to coordinate. It expected predictable tactical patterns that could be mapped and countered. It expected an enemy that would tire, that would fragment under pressure, that would eventually reach a point where continued resistance became obviously impossible. It did not find any of those things. Human military units did not fight from a central command. Authority to make tactical decisions was distributed all the way down to individual ship captains and small unit commanders, who changed their strategies in real time based on what they observed directly in front of them. When one approach was countered, human units switched to another, without waiting for orders from above. When a new council tactic appeared on the field, human analysts flagged it across the communication network within minutes, and improvised countermeasures were tested and shared openly. The full disruption arrays prevented the Armada's largest dreadnoughts from making the precision short jumps they relied on for rapid repositioning, forcing them to move at conventional speeds through space that Aegis had already seeded with prepared kill zones. And the humans kept fighting, not because they were stronger than the Armada, not because their weapons outmatched the Council's by any objective measure, but because stopping was not something any human commander had been trained to do, and because somewhere in 80 years of rapid expansion, and a few 100,000 years of surviving everything the natural world had put in front of them, the human species had developed a relationship with adversity that the Council's 4,000 years of uncontested power had never needed to understand. They did not stop when they were hurt. They did not stop when they were losing ground. They regrouped, adapted, and came back from angles the enemy was not watching. After 19 hours, the Armada had taken losses it had never taken before in its entire history. 31 warships were destroyed or disabled, a small fraction of the total fleet, but a fraction that represented something the Council's forces had never encountered before. An enemy that was still fighting and still finding new ways to fight after nearly an entire day of combat. And then Fleet Marshal Drennock, the Armada's supreme commander, did something that would be discussed in military academies across the galaxy for generations. He ordered a general retreat. 400 warships, the most powerful military force in the known galaxy, turned away from a single small star system and withdrew. In Council space, the news arrived before the fleet did. In receiving halls and diplomatic chambers and military briefing rooms across 47 civilizations, beings that had not experienced fear as a political reality and living memory began to feel something very close to it, moving through their institutions, like a cold draft through a room, been sealed for a long time. They had sent the Armada, the weapon that ended civilizations. The Armada had retreated. Species that kept their feelings carefully private kept them private still. But in hallways and in small rooms where the real conversations always happened, one question circulated in dozens of alien languages, all of them translating to the same basic thing. What are they? Nobody had a satisfying answer. The traders who had spent years doing business at the edge of human space and always changed the subject when the politics came up, they had known something about this question. They had suspected that the easy assumptions about humanity were wrong. But even they had not imagined this. On Earth, General Hassan stood outside the Aegis Command Center in the lunar rock and looked at a feed showing the Armada's departure vector. 400 ships growing smaller on the sensors, moving away, carrying with them the news of what had happened here. She had been right that the Council would send something larger than 12 ships. She was also already thinking about what came after this, because she understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent their whole career thinking several moves ahead, that a force this large does not retreat and then give up. Vorath Cell stood at the viewport of his flagship bridge for a long time after the channel closed. Not because he was thinking carefully, but because for the first time in 4 centuries, he needed a moment to process something he had not expected. A single word, 2 letters, 1 syllable, spoken by a small gray-haired creature on a planet he had never personally bothered to visit. And somehow it had landed like an open-handed slap across his face in front of the entire galaxy. His 6 limbs tensed, his 4 eyes narrowed to slits, and then he turned away from the viewport and walked back to the center of his command deck, with the composed, measured steps of someone who has decided that a problem simply needs to be handled more firmly. "Arm the forward bombardment arrays," he said quietly to his weapons officer. "Target the large moon in low orbit. Full demonstration sequence. I want the light visible from their surface with the naked eye." His weapons officer hesitated for exactly half a second. "Emissary, a full demonstration sequence against their moon would remind them that they are very small and we are very large," Vorath said, without changing his tone at all. "Arm the arrays." The weapons officer obeyed. The Council had used demonstration bombardments many times before, targeted, controlled strikes against a nearby celestial body, designed to show a non-compliant species exactly what kind of firepower was being pointed in their direction. It was a standard tactic. It had worked 38 times, without exception. The species in question would watch their moon or their neighboring asteroid get torn apart, and that usually ended the conversation very quickly and very permanently. Vorath Cell was not anticipating any difficulty. He should have been. What Vorath Cell did not know, what no Council intelligence operative had discovered in 30 years of carefully watching humanity, was that Earth's governments had been preparing for exactly this kind of moment since their very first contact with alien civilization. The public story had always been diplomacy, trade agreements, cultural exchange programs, interstellar friendship initiatives. Humanity's official face to the galaxy had been open hands and warm greetings. But behind closed doors, in classified facilities buried inside asteroids and hidden beneath the surfaces of 3 moons, a very different project had been running for 3 full decades. It was called the Aegis Protocol. Aegis had no single headquarters, no central command structure, and no obvious presence that an outside observer could point to and identify as a military installation. It was distributed, decentralized, and deliberately designed to look like nothing from the outside. Thousands of small autonomous weapon platforms were embedded throughout the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter. Rail strike batteries had been tunneled deep into the rock of 4 different moons. Gravitational tether drones, a technology humanity had quietly developed from first principles after studying recovered alien ship designs, waited in deep space positions that no Council survey had ever mapped. The whole system had been built on one simple principle, that someday someone bigger would come and ask for something humanity was not willing to give. That day had arrived. When Vorath Cell's 12 warships began powering up their bombardment arrays, the Aegis network registered the energy signatures and began calculating responses automatically. The system did not need a human operator to select a target. It needed only a human operator to give the authorization. Deep in an underground command center built into the far side of Earth's moon, a young colonel named Yusuf Ibarra sat in front of a console he had trained on for 8 years, and then secretly hoped he would never actually have to use. His hands were steady on the controls. His heart was not. He read the authorization codes arriving from the Secretary General's office, verified them twice against the protocol checklist, and then spoke into his headset with a calm that surprised even himself. "Aegis Protocol is hot," he said, his voice flat and clear in the silence of the command center. "All units are authorized to respond. Targeting restriction is in full effect. Weapons and sensor systems only. Absolutely no crew casualties." The response took 47 seconds. 47 seconds was not a long time. In 47 seconds, a person can tie their shoes, pour a glass of water, or read a short message on their communicator. In 47 seconds, the Aegis network put 312 rail strike projectiles into space at precisely calculated angles, timed to arrive simultaneously, directed at the bombardment arrays of all 12 Council warships at once. The shots did not miss. Not a single one. The bombardment arrays on Vorath Cell's flagship went dark first, all 4 of them, in rapid sequence. Each hit so precisely that the structural integrity of the ship itself was not compromised at all. Then the secondary weapon systems went dark. Then the long-range sensor arrays. Then the communication relays. Then the navigation drives. Around him, the other 11 ships went through the same process at nearly the same moment. Vorath Cell stood on his bridge and watched his tactical display go dark, piece by piece, system by system, and he could not make sense of what he was seeing, because nothing was supposed to be capable of doing this. There were no visible ships attacking them. No enemy fleet had engaged them in open battle. The strikes had come from everywhere and nowhere, from directions his sensors had logged as empty space, from positions that no military installation was supposed to occupy. And then the gravitational tether drones activated. The 12 warships were held in place, not violently, not aggressively, but firmly and completely, by a web of interlocking gravitational fields that his engineers would spend the next 6 hours trying to break, and would never manage to overcome. The flagship's bridge was very quiet. Vorafsel looked at his tactical officer. His tactical officer looked back at him with an expression that, across species boundaries, communicated the same basic idea. Neither of them had anything useful to say. A communication request came in from Earth, not a broadcast this time, but a direct, narrow-beam channel addressed specifically to Vorafsel. He accepted it. Miriam Osei's face appeared on his screen. She looked exactly as she had looked when she said no, calm, unhurried, and completely unimpressed by the scale of his ships. "Grand Emissary," she said, "your crews are unharmed. Your ships are structurally unharmed. The weapons and sensor systems that were neutralized can be repaired within a week at any properly equipped facility. You are free to leave as soon as the tether drones release you, which will happen in approximately 10 minutes. She held his gaze for a moment. "Please return to the Council and tell them what you observed here today. We are always open to discussing peaceful terms of mutual recognition, but tribute will not be part of that conversation." The channel closed. 10 minutes later, the tether drones released their hold on the fleet. The 12 warships, blind, deaf, completely unarmed, and deeply humiliated, turned away from Earth and began the long journey back to Council space. On Earth, the footage was everywhere within hours. People celebrated in the streets of Lagos, Sao Paulo, Mumbai, Sydney, and 100 other cities. Music poured from open windows. Strangers embraced each other on sidewalks. Children who did not fully understand what had happened ran through their neighborhoods cheering because the adults around them were cheering, and that was good enough reason for children. In the UN Assembly Chamber, delegates who had been drafting gracious letters of surrender 2 hours earlier were now slapping each other on the back and behaving as though they had always been completely confident in the outcome. Speeches were given, flags were raised. Someone in Rio de Janeiro set off fireworks that lasted until 3 in the morning. Only in the deep underground command center, near the lunar far side, was there no celebration at all. Colonel Yusuf Ibarra sat at his console and stared at the screens showing the Council fleet's departure trajectory. Around him, his team worked quietly and methodically, cross-checking sensor data, writing detailed reports, cataloging every aspect of the Aegis network's performance in exact technical language. General Hassan appeared beside him after a long while, looking at the same screens in the same silence. "They're leaving," Ibarra said at last. "They're going home to report," Hassan replied. Her voice was flat and careful, stripped of anything that might be mistaken for relief. "And when they report, the Council will send something considerably larger than 12 ships." Ibarra said nothing for a moment. He already knew she was right, and there was nothing about being right that felt worth celebrating tonight. Outside, the fireworks in Rio de Janeiro continued, bright and joyful and completely unaware of what was already being set in motion on the other side of the galaxy. Each vessel stretched longer than a mountain range, dark as the space between stars, covered in angular black armor that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. They materialized in perfect formation above the equator, 12 silent giants hanging in the sky like a sentence humanity had not been ready to read. Every radar station, every orbital defense satellite, every telescope array on Earth, and across all 14 human colony worlds locked onto them within the first 30 seconds. The year was 2387. Humanity had been traveling between stars for 80 years, a short time by any galactic measure. In those 80 years, the human race had colonized 14 worlds, built hundreds of orbital stations, established trade routes with a small number of cautious alien species, and generally made itself known as a civilization that was loud, curious, inventive, and growing fast. The alien traders humanity had dealt with had always seemed careful with their words, always reluctant to speak about the wider galaxy in any detail, always quick to change the subject when the conversation drifted toward power structures and politics among the stars. Now humanity was beginning to understand why those traders had chosen their words so carefully. The 12 ships belonged to the Galactic Hegemony Council, a union of 47 alien civilizations that had controlled the known galaxy for over 4,000 years. They had absorbed smaller species, annexed fertile star systems, dismantled civilizations that refused to cooperate, and maintained order through a system of tribute that every member world and every new species under their reach was required to honor without question. They had never been refused, not once in 4,000 years. Within 5 minutes of the ship's arrival, every communication device on Earth, every screen, every speaker, every holographic display in every home, office, and public square, activated without warning and showed the same image. It was a figure standing before a background of deep red light, tall, with 6 limbs, 4 eyes arranged in a perfect square across a flat face, and robes that moved as if drifting in water, despite the fact that there was no wind. When it spoke, the sound came in harmonic layers, and translation software across the human network worked furiously to keep pace. The figure introduced itself as Grand Emissary Vorath Sel, senior representative of the Galactic Hegemony Council, and it spoke the way something speaks when it has never once had cause to doubt that its words would be obeyed. People of the human collective, the translation rendered in every human language at once, the Galactic Hegemony Council formally acknowledges your civilization's expansion beyond your home system. Under Council jurisdiction, all spacefaring species are required to contribute to the stability and prosperity of the hegemony. You will surrender 40% of your total resource production across all settled worlds to Council redistribution programs. You will cede 20% of your inhabited colony planets to hegemony resettlement authorities. You will designate 30% of your military forces to serve under direct Council command as auxiliary units. Full compliance is expected within 72 standard galactic hours. Any resistance will be classified as hostile action and addressed accordingly. The broadcast ended without ceremony. Inside the UN Unified Planetary Assembly in Geneva, the noise that followed was enormous. The great glass dome chamber held over 400 delegates from every nation on Earth and representatives from all 14 colony worlds. And within seconds of the broadcast ending, they were all talking or shouting at the same time. Data screens around the walls cycled through tactical readouts, energy signature analyses of the 12 ships, and emergency intelligence reports being pushed by every defense agency on Earth. The reports were not reassuring. The 12 ships in orbit carried weapons capable of sustained planetary bombardment. Their drive technology was far ahead of anything humanity had built. Their hull materials absorbed sensor probes and returned nothing useful. And according to records recovered from alien traders over the past 30 years, these 12 ships were not the Council's main military force. They were a diplomatic courtesy fleet, a small delegation sent to manage what the Council considered a routine administrative matter. Ambassador Cheng Wei of the East Asian Federation rose to his feet and pressed both fists against his podium. "We are 80 years old as a spacefaring species, and they are 4,000, he said loudly, his voice sharp with fear that had been dressed up to look like reason. "Our weapons are toys compared to theirs. Our world's number 14, theirs number in the hundreds. We cannot fight this. Compliance is the only road that keeps our people alive." 12 other delegations stood in immediate agreement. From across the chamber, General Fatima Hassan of the African Union Defense Bloc did not stand. She simply spoke, clearly and without raising her voice, in a way that cut through the noise and made people stop to listen. "Look at the civilizations that complied," she said. "Look at what they are now. resource colonies, labor pools, species that once had names and histories and cultures, reduced to line items in a council budget. If we give them 40% today, we give them 60 in 20 years, and we give them everything in 50. Compliance is not survival. It is a slower kind of extinction. The chamber broke into chaos again. Historians presented records of 32 civilizations that had refused the council's tribute demands in the past. All 32 were either gone entirely, or so thoroughly absorbed into the hegemony that no meaningful trace of their original culture survived. Military analysts showed survival probability models that assigned humanity's chances of successful armed resistance at somewhere between very low and effectively zero. Medical organizations begged the chamber to consider the human cost of a war that could not be won. The data pointed in one direction, almost all of it. At the head of the chamber's long crescent table, Secretary General Miriam Osei had been sitting quietly for the entire 3 hours. She was 71 years old, small and upright in her chair, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of stillness that comes not from indifference, but from a very deep and disciplined kind of thinking. She had been born in Accra, had studied international law in London and Nairobi, had spent 2 decades mediating peace negotiations in regions where both sides considered mercy a weakness, and had somehow arrived at the 7th decade of her life, with her patience and her backbone both fully intact. She listened to every argument in that chamber. She read every data report pushed to her tablet. She looked up through the chamber's wide skylight at the dark sky above Geneva, where even now, through the atmosphere, she knew the 12 warships were hanging in their perfect formation, patient, enormous, and very certain of what the answer would be. She thought about the 32 civilizations. She thought about the traitors who always changed the subject. She thought about her grandchildren on the colony world of New Carthage, and what their lives would look like if the word spoken today was the wrong one. She stood up. The chamber went silent, quiet, not all at once, but steadily, delegate by delegate, until the only sound was the low hum of the ventilation system and the faint noise of protest crowds gathered outside the building. Miriam reached forward and pressed the button that opened a direct live channel to Vorath Cell's flagship. Every council species in the galaxy was monitoring Earth's communications. 47 civilizations, hundreds of tributary worlds, thousands of years of unbroken precedent, all waiting to hear a human being say yes. Vorath Cell's four-eyed face filled the screen. He looked down at her with the absolute calm of something that had never been surprised. Miriam Osei looked back at him. She leaned toward the microphone and spoke one word, clearly, without hesitation, without apology, and with no suggestion whatsoever that she expected to say it twice. No. The channel closed. The chamber was perfectly silent. On the Grand Emissary's flagship, 12 officers stared at their commander and waited for an order. Vorath Cell said nothing, because in 400 years of service to the Council, in a career that had spanned the submission of 63 different civilizations, he had never once needed to prepare for this. And across the galaxy, in the receiving halls and data centers of 47 member civilizations, one syllable arrived like a stone thrown into still water, and the ripples spread outward in every direction at once.